Hello, and thanks for tuning in to the UCL SELCS Open Day. I'm Dr. Claire Thomson, and I'm going to give you, in the next 10 minutes or so, a little taster session, which is based on the kind of workshop that I would usually run for the in-person SELCS Open Days. And the subject of that workshop is film, the kind of film studies that you would do in your first year at UCL if you were to come here as a student of Modern Languages plus Film. As you can see from this cover slide, my job title is quite specific. I'm an Associate Professor of Scandinavian Film, and that reflects my research specialism, but I teach much more widely across film studies in SELCS, and that includes the first year module in a kind of an introduction to film studies, really, which is called How to Read Film. You may also be wondering why there is a muscly gentleman with a splendid moustache here on my cover image. Really, film history, the history of moving images, starts with him. This is a man called Eugene Sandow. He was German originally, and he was kind of a variety artist, a strong man, as you could see, and he had various spectacular tricks that he would do on stage. And because of his fame and his popularity, he, by the way, still has a fan club. You can Google him. Because of his popularity, he was one of the first people to be filmed by Thomas Edison, the inventor, when he was trialling his new technology of recording moving images and then screening them. So the first thing that you would see in the very first lecture of how to read film is, in fact, Eugene Sandow. In that first lecture, we ask the question, what was cinema? And the tense there is important. We are coming to the history of film from a position of post-cinema. You are all children of the digital age. For us, cinema is not what it used to be. The technology is very different. The culture of cinema going and film consumption is very different. So that's the perspective that we take. We go right back to the beginning of the moving image in the mid 1890s. What did people think that moving images were for? And why did film or cinema develop as it did? Why did it develop into a technology that told stories that was actually not inevitable at all? So the third reason why we go right the way back to the beginning to Eugene Sandow is that I believe that by examining moving images in their earliest and simplest forms, we can better understand how the language and the technology of cinema has evolved. Now, to show you what I mean, let's have a look at this very early film featuring Eugene Sandow. As you can see, that dates from 1894. And this is a very short film. It really doesn't do anything other than this. In an in-person open day, I would be asking you questions about what you're noticing about this little film, what's strange about it. And people often comment on the fact that it looks a bit like a photograph that has started to move. The composition is very simple. All of the focus is on the spectacular body of Eugene Sandow in this kind of mid-shot, very simply lit. So it's essentially a moving photograph, and that's quite important because, of course, new media technologies don't just appear out of nowhere. They build on what has come before. And in order for people to understand how they are supposed to read them, understand them, use them, they have to borrow from conventions that people are used to. So a key term that I've used a couple of times so far is spectacular. So just bear that in mind because we'll be coming back to that. But first I want to show you the kind of equipment that people would have watched this Sandow film on. This is a machine called the kinetoscope, which again was invented by the Thomas Edison company. And this is an example which is on display at the Musée Lumière, the Lumière Brothers Museum in Lyon in France. As you can see, it's basically a cabinet, and that metal thing on the top is a kind of eyepiece where people would look down into the cabinet to watch the film. And immediately this seems quite strange to us because it doesn't look like cinema as we would recognise it. And yet, if you stop and think about it, it's pretty much what you're doing just now, sitting in front of your laptop, probably. Or if you watch television, that's also often an individual and quite an intimate experience. So Edison was on the wrong track as far as cinema was concerned, but he had invented a visual technology which really does look very much like some of the ways in which we consume moving images even today. Now, on the other side of the Atlantic, and we are biased in favour, of course, of this side of the Atlantic in SELCS, the year later, two brothers in Lyon in France, Auguste and Louis Lumière, a very appropriate name, of course, that just means light in French. They belonged to a family which had a factory that produced photographic paper and products like that. So they were very much in the trade already, and they were inventors and had been experimenting with both capturing moving images, so making photographs move essentially, and then ways to project those images to a large audience. So on the left there, we've got a classic looking French poster depicting what it was like to sit in the audience and watch these early films. And you can see that this looks a lot more like what we would think of as cinema, people sitting in a dark space and watching images projected onto a wall in front of them. This apparatus, the cinematograph, spread throughout Europe quite quickly. On the right-hand side, we have a poster advertising a cinematograph projection here in London, in Marlborough Hall on Regent Street. But this was dramatically new, and the Lumiere brothers had to explain to people what it was that they would be paying their money to see. This is the poster that advertised their first screening of cinematograph films at the Salon Indien. That was a cafe in Paris. And they are offering a screening of 10 very short films that they had made on subjects like the baby's breakfast and the arrival of a train and the sea, and a film called Leaving the Factory. And what they have to do here is explain what the apparatus does. This is my rough translation from French. It enables the capture by a series of instantaneous samples all the movements which during a given time take place in front of the lens, and then they are projected in natural size before a full room onto a screen. Now, I like this poster because it does demonstrate the advantages of studying languages alongside film in order to understand what people thought they were seeing, in order to understand how cinema fitted into the culture of the time. It really helps if we have access to the original languages. So the very first film that was made by the Lumiere brothers is this one, and its title is really not as exciting as Eugene Sandow, the bodybuilder. It's the people who worked in the factory, the Lumiere factory, leaving the factory at the end of their shift on a day in March in 1895. And as you can see, it's really just a crowd of workers spilling out of the factory gates in a great stream. They are all slightly different, and yet they are similar. And there are little surprising details, like this guy on his bike, for example. And in a moment we'll see that actually a horse and carriage is also coming out of the factory gates. So some unexpected details, but it's essentially just people leaving the factory. And this strange and banal little film has emerged in French culture, at least, as the birth of cinema. In 1995, 100 years after this film was made, the 100th anniversary of cinema was celebrated in Paris. And so it really is that film, Leaving the Factory, that is taken to be the birth certificate of cinema. Here is a model in the Lumiere Museum in Lyon of that factory complex where the film was shot. The street where it was shot has now been renamed to Rue Premier Film, the street of the first film. So that tells you something about the cultural importance of filmmaking for French culture. But what I love as well is that in that model, they have actually inserted a screen on which this very first film, leaving the factory, loops again and again in the spot on the model where the people were spilling out of the factory. So this is my little home movie from the museum. And I've superimposed there 3 words: space, time, and body, because I think this kind of commemoration is really important. How do we, in our time, commemorate what was important about the past? And what seems to be important here is that the film captures a moment in time, a very specific moment in time on a specific date. And it captures people in a specific place, a space, and it captures bodies moving. So even though that film is really not very much like the Sandow film, it does have a lot in common with it. It captures a moving body, or moving bodies, plural in this case, as spectacular in their own sense. In other words, watching moving bodies on screen is enough for people to be entertained at that point. My second little home video here, I've called 24 frames a second, and these are 2 little souvenir books that I picked up from the Lumiere Museum. And as you can see, they are traditional flip books. And here we have the film again in the form of a flip book, people leaving the factory. And another little book which gives you a taste of another famous early film, L'arrivée d'un train, the arrival of a train at La Ciotat station. This one was famous because people allegedly, when they watched this film, were convinced that the train was going to come out of the screen and run them over. That's probably apocryphal. But what's important there is that the flip books remind us of that very physical instantiation of the earliest films, 24 still images per second passing in front of the light of the projector, and passing so fast that our brains are tricked into thinking that the images are actually moving. Those are the things that I would emphasize about this very early cinema. People, of course, have theorized this in different ways, and 2 key words in French that you might want to pick up and run with are actualité and féerie. These are 2 common types of film, 2 common functions for film at the time in that first decade of cinema, roughly. Films which record the world as it is, people leaving the factory. And then trick films that are more like entertainment. They might include some early special effects, or they might just be a spectacular body flexing its muscles in front of the camera. But what all of these early films have in common is that they don't really tell stories as such. I mean, for sure, you can say that they have a beginning, a middle, and an end to some extent. But there's no plot, there's no suspense. What they are doing is really just giving us access to spectacle, as it's often been called. Things that surprise us, that charm us, that give us pleasure in some way. And so that early period of cinema has often been called the cinema of attractions. That's a term that stems from the film scholar Tom Gunning. Something for you to follow up on, if you like. The example that I want to leave you with is from Denmark. Whichever language or culture you're hoping to study when you come to UCL, probably moving images reached that country quite quickly. And you can usually trace this. And you might even be able to trace who was responsible in each country for making the first films. In the case of Denmark, it was this man here, Peter Elfeldt, who had a job as the photographer to the royal court. That's really significant. He was already a still photographer. And so it made sense for him to expand into moving images. But it also means that a lot of the earliest moving images in Denmark were in fact of the royal family. But I'm fascinated by the oldest preserved film of his, which is called Kørsel med grønlandske hunde, Driving with Greenlandic Dogs. And here we have it. This is not in Greenland at all, it's in a snow-covered park in Copenhagen. But the dogs are reeling off, as you can see. And just watch what happens now. You see, this is where I miss teaching in person, because at this point, every time for the last 10 years that I've used this film, everybody laughs, and I bet that you sniggered a little bit, and then we could start to delve into the reasons why this film of 1897 still makes us laugh even today. It's something about the unexpected, isn't it? That the sledge comes back into the frame of the image when we don't expect it to, because it has left the filmic space. It's gone round behind the camera. It has broken a convention that we take for granted, which is that film will never actually show us what's behind the camera. I have a theory, and someday I might write a book on this, that Peter Elfelt was all too aware of the impact that little conceit in his film, Driving with Greenlandic Dogs, would have had. He's not breaking a rule because the rule doesn't exist yet, but I think he's smart enough and experienced enough as a professional photographer to know that there's something quite special about the frame. And when we move from the still photographic image to the moving image, by using that frame in unexpected ways, he's actually highlighting the magic of the moving image, this brand new technology. So that's what I'll leave you with for now, and I hope that I might see some of you this autumn or further into the future.